I was looking on my favorite website to find free items being given away by kind people when I found an ad for this lawnmower, but when I got it home I wasn't sure what engine was on the mower because I was unfamiliar with it. After taking some of the covers off the engine, I soon realized what brand it was, but it had me wondering if there was anything else on this engine that was strange, and after some time it didn't take long to figure out the answer to that question. In today's video, we're going to be looking at this Craftsman lawnmower, and the problem is that it won't start, mainly because the pull rope won't go back into the engine. Now, I wasn't sure if this mower was even worth fixing because the self-propel system was already taken out by the last person who owned it, but my curiosity to find out if I can save this mower from the scrapyard won out against all logic. So let's see just how weird this engine really is. Now, I'm going to try and repair this mower, but yours might be a little different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it, and I'll be glad to answer your questions. In the last video on this mower, we tried to do some light diagnostic work on it before the pull rope decided to not cooperate. After a fairly involved cleaning, mainly to try and figure out if there was an oil leak, we finally got down to the flywheel. The next thing we need to do is to remove the flywheel and see if we can find the source of all this oil. Now, to remove the flywheel, I'm going to use a 2-jaw puller, but in this situation, a 3-jaw would have been a better idea. If you're going to do this, make sure the brake handle is tied down to the handlebar, otherwise you could break off the shoe. Now, luckily it broke free, but it could have easily broken apart as well. Now, after getting it out of the way, we can see the top part of the crankshaft and also the top seal. If this engine is like other Tecumsehs, the top bearing should have pressurized oiling, and I figured this is where all the oil was coming from. Now, it is dirty here, but there's just one issue. All this oil and dirt has been here for a very long time, and none of it is fresh oil. That means the top plate might just be loose and allowing dirt to collect here, but there is no active leak here, so I'm happy to snug down the bolts and move on then. Now that I know there isn't a serious oil leak here, I'll just reinstall the flywheel along with all the parts that go with it. At least we also get a chance to examine if the key for the flywheel is sheared, which it isn't. If yours is, then you'll need to replace it, otherwise you might have a starting issue. The next item we need to look at is the carb. Now, I know we haven't been able to figure out if the engine starts and runs yet, but while the mower is on the table, I'm going to take the opportunity to service it. Now, this is going to be somewhat interesting. The reason is I don't typically deal with this type of carb. I've only had to work on one other one like this, which, if you recall, was a generator that was left at my friend's shop. Now, I have to admire them for going out on a limb and trying something different. However, because it's so different, there could be some issues with cleaning it, and you'll see what happens later on in the video. After releasing the retaining clip, the bowl section will just drop away from the rest of the carb, and then we can inspect it and see if we need to clean it or not. So my initial impression is that this carb is in really good condition, and because the bowl section is mainly plastic, there's no corrosion to worry about. Now, after getting the emulsion tube out, it's also in really good shape, and all the openings are clear as well. After that, I want to look at the fuel jet that's behind the drain bolt and the gasket. If you take a closer look, you can see the spring that sits against the fuel jet. The spring is there to put pressure on the jet to seal against a rubber seat, so it's important that you do not lose the spring. Here's a closer view of it inside the carb. Now, after carefully getting it out, we'll make sure it's clear. So to make sure it's clear, I'm going to pass a small wire through the opening. What this does is that it will clear any blockages in the opening. After that, make sure the wire will pass through the opening in the carb where it sits against the rubber seat. I'm also going to make sure this opening is clear at the top part of the assembly. After that, I'll then use compressed air or carb cleaner in all the passages. Once that's done, I'll start to put the carb back together again. So what do I think about this strange carb design? Well, it's not bad at all. What typically happens on most carbs is that the fuel jet will clog up, and with this design, removing the drain bolt gets you full access to the jet. And if for some reason you need to remove the bowl to inspect it, you only need to pry off the retainer. So if it's so easy to service, why don't you see this carb more often? Well, I can't answer that question, but maybe someone with more information can. Once the bowl is back in place, very carefully push the retainer back into position. Now, before we move on, we need to make sure the bowl is seated against the body of the carb, otherwise we could have an air leak or worse yet, a fuel leak. Now, I don't want to put the entire mower back together yet. Instead, I want to put some fuel into the carb with my bottle through the fuel line. After that, I'm going to tie down the brake handle and then try starting the engine by using my drill. If this works, it should run until we run out of fuel or until I turn it off. So fortunately the engine started and ran, and even though I could have left it running for another minute, I don't typically make it a habit to do test runs on the table for obvious safety reasons. Now if you're curious, I turned it off by grounding the small wire on the coil to the metal on the engine by using my pliers. I also don't see any fresh oil around the plate, so I'm pretty certain about our theory on the dirt and oil taking several years to build up. Now at this point, I think I'm ready to start to put the mower back together, but after seeing this engine without all its metal covers, I do have some criticisms about this engine design. I find it to be somewhat random on where some of the fasteners go. Now it could be that I'm so used to other brands that I'm having a hard time changing, but I've always found that Tecumseh engines are like this. Now maybe if I was more familiar with it, I wouldn't have an issue, but as of right now, this design doesn't seem as intuitive as the others I've worked on. Now the two tiny fasteners they used to hold the recoil to the cover somehow backed out and came loose. This allowed the recoil to not work the way it's supposed to, and it partly caused the recoil to bind up on us when I pulled on it. So why only use 2 screws while others might use 3 medium bolts or even rivets? The only thing I could come up with is money. The smaller the fasteners are and with fewer of them means more money saved, but to be quite honest, for it to have lasted for almost 20 years, I think it was a fair decision on their part. It also makes replacing the recoil fairly easy in comparison to drilling out the heads on some rivets. But which one would I prefer then? 2 small screws or 3 pop rivets? To be honest, I really don't care, but replacing the recoil on the Tecumseh by removing 2 screws is a lot easier in my mind. Of course, I'm very partial to the Honda's version using 3 studs and 3 nuts, but I'll save that argument for a different video. Now there is one very big issue I have with the design of this engine, and it's the placement of the vent for the emission system. When I first saw it, I wasn't sure what it was used for, but now that I'm installing the air filter base, I realize what it is. The breather hose from the filter base is supposed to connect to it, but as you can tell, it's in a location that's very tough to film, let alone see. Also, don't forget to install the gasket to the front of the carb. The reason why is because it's important to the priming system. If the gasket is damaged or missing, the primer will not work and the engine will be extremely tough to start when cold. Now the one for this carb finally came loose, and to deal with it, I carefully glued it in place on the airbox. I could have glued it to the carb as well, but I decided to use the airbox instead. One thing you're going to notice when putting the engine back together is that there's an order of operation. What that means is that you can accidentally put a part on that may get in the way of a different part. You can of course do the same thing on an engine from a different brand, but on this one it's a lot easier to do. So I'd take your time and be careful, otherwise you might find yourself in a pickle and you'll have to remove items to be able to get other ones installed. So if I were you, I'd either take notes, take pictures, or do what I'm doing and film the removal process. That way you'll have an easier time putting everything back on. Oh, there's still the matter with the fuel cap. Now in the last video, we discovered that the metal bell that's part of the air venting system for the fuel tank was missing. Well, it turns out the bell simply fell off the cap and landed inside the tank. To fix it, we simply need to put it back on and then using a soldering iron, melt the plastic in the middle to secure it. Now without this metal bell, the venting system won't work the way it's supposed to, and the carb might not get enough fuel, and eventually after a few minutes of running will stop as though it's ran out of gas. What's going to happen is that you're going to check to see if there's any gasoline in the tank, and the moment you take the fuel cap off, that's going to allow air inside the tank, and the gasoline will then make its way to the carb like it's supposed to. Then you'll restart the engine only for it to happen again. The last few things we need to do is to put some fresh 100% gasoline which has no ethanol in the tank, put the pull rope back on its anchor on the handle, and then put the mower back on the ground, prime the engine, and see if it starts and runs. When it first started, the engine sounded great, but as it got warmer, it started to sputter. It's difficult to hear on camera, but in person, it's very noticeable. Now, it could be a bad spark plug, or the tip of the plug could be fouled with carbon, but after getting it out, I don't see the amount of carbon that it would need to make it sputter like that. I did check the gap on the plug, and it was not out of tolerance. Now, I don't carry this specific model of spark plug, but since I didn't see anything wrong with it, I'm just going to put it back into the engine. Now, I did have to wonder if the head bolts might have backed out in the last 20 years of service and is causing some sort of air leak, and surprisingly they were kind of loose, so I'll just tighten them down and then we'll see if that makes any difference. So unfortunately it's still sputtering, so the loose head bolts didn't have any effect on the way the engine was running. It was just the source of a small oil leak, so hopefully there won't be any more oil on the deck. So what could be causing the sputtering then? Well, there could be a few reasons. The first one is the carb is giving too much fuel to the engine, and the second reason could be a leaking valve. Now, if it's the valves, we're going to be in trouble because on this particular engine, that's going to be a tough one to fix, so hopefully the carb is the issue. Now, I can either take the carb off for a full inspection and a good cleaning, or I can just replace the carb for a mere $13 shipped to my door. To be quite honest with you, for that price, I'd rather just replace the carb because it's easier. I know a lot of the viewers would have me run to my nearest Harbor Freight and purchase an ultrasonic cleaner, but if you've seen some of my past videos, you know that I have some reservations about getting one and using them on carbs. Now, for those of you who don't know, I do think ultrasonic cleaners work well. However, I don't think it's a guarantee that it will work. I'd rather put the effort into just ordering a new carb instead. So what are my thoughts about this Craftsman mower with a very strange Tecumseh engine and an even stranger carb? Well, I like it. It's unconventional. I think that's the reason why I feel that way about it. It sort of reminds me of using a 40-year-old lawn boy. It's unique, and to me, that means it's special. Now, if it had a working self-propel system on it, I'd definitely consider keeping it, but with it being as heavy as it is, I know I'm not going to like using it. So my question is, what do you think is causing the engine to sputter like this? Do you think the carb is the issue, or do you think it's something else? Now, if it turns out to be something else, I don't think I'm going to bother with it, but if it's just the carb, I think $13 is a cheap investment to find out. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.